Hello, this is Ross Bond in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I decided we would go into depth on my SK book on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. And this is a book I published on Amazon.com, and you can buy a copy there. Just type in my name, Ross, Bagne. Bond. It's pronounced Bond, but it's spelled Bagne. It's a French word. I won't go into the exact meaning because it's a little strange. You can find it in the novel Papillon. Papillon. But anyway, I wanted to start from the beginning of my book, so we have a full explanation from beginning to end. And each of these studies will last 30 minutes because that's pretty much the limit of my bandwidth in uploading to my internet site. The book Soren Kierkegaard is the result of a total of 8 years of study. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on who I am, where I came from, why I became so interested in SK. I started to study SK. By the way, his name is pronounced Kierkegaard correctly, but often people say Kierkegaard or many different variations of the name. I just call him SK for short. But I came across the works of SK when I was in a 19th century philosophy course at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I also studied in that same course the many different 19th century philosophers, especially Hegel. And we'll have a lot to talk about the philosophy of Hegel. And also I took a lot of political science courses in political philosophy, and I also, in the same period at GW, became familiar with also the works of Karl Marx, and we'll get into a lot of that also as we go along. It wasn't until I was 24 years old that I really started to become interested in SK. And that was at the time of my conversion to Christianity. Because at the time I had a very strong predilection toward aesthetics and philosophy. And I found SK so interesting because intuitively I saw during my courses at GW that there was something wrong with Hegel's thinking. It sounded good, but intuitively I felt it, but intellectually I could not really explain. In SK, I found the key to the problem. So I really became obsessed with studying SK, and I read all of his aesthetic and philosophical works. It took me about 2 years, and I decided that someday I wanted to write a book that really could kind of summarize what all of this complex thinking is all about in all of SK's aesthetic and philosophical works. So someday I decided that I'm going to do that. And the opportune moment came about when I was 50 years old. And I decided to start because due to my business relationships and the nature of my business, I had a lot of extra time. And so I decided that I would start my book. And the first thing I did was I reread everything that I had read before on SK. I read 2 biographies, one by Walter Lowry, the great 2-volume set, which is really the definitive biography, in my opinion, at least in the English language. Then I read another biography many times by Johannes Hollenberg, I believe his name is. Yes, Johannes Hollenberg. And I read a great deal of his religious works also, because what we're really looking at is only about 1/3 of his entire works. I mean, we have the aesthetic and philosophical works, and then we have his religious works, and then we have his journals. His journals comprise about 4 thick volumes like this. I can get one for you here. Oops. There goes Luther. Okay. Here's one. Here's one. It's this is just one of Kierkegaard's journals and papers. I've read a number of them, but I have not read all of them, obviously, because that would take me, a few more years to study those. And of course, he had his enormous religious works. But what we're going to really concentrate on in these works are his aesthetic and philosophical books. S.K. was a Danish philosopher who lived from 1813 to 1855. So therefore, he died at the age of 45 years old. 42 years old, I'm sorry. 42. Now, that was really pretty much the average lifespan of a person during that time. But what's really amazing is the prolific nature of his writing. And I can't imagine it. He did not have a word processor. He did not have all the modern conveniences of printing and everything. But yet he was able to produce this enormous volume of insight and intellectual thinking about what Christianity is and how to differentiate it from aesthetics and philosophy. So to start the series, I thought it's very important to explain that the book that I wrote on SK really does need more explanation. And the more explanation, the better the reader is going to understand it. You can buy the book and then listen to these videotapes if you want. And these will be on my links to these will be on my Facebook page at facebook.com. Now, the works we're going to look at are all his aesthetic and philosophical works, with the exception of Concept of Irony and De Omnibus Dubitandum Est. These were, in my opinion, preliminary investigations into his thought, and are really not that necessary for the understanding of SK, because we'll get into all that thinking later on. We'll bring in, I think, some of Concept of Irony and De Omnibus Dubitandum Est. And what I try to do in this book, as much as possible, is to explain the more philosophical terms that SK liked to use, and in terms of that a non-philosopher like myself can understand. For example, the term dialectical, what does it mean? Well, really, it means the art or skill of making logical distinctions and or descriptions of things, especially with the dialectic of time involved. And of course, if you know Hegelian dialectics, you know the old story there about the spirit moving through history as the truth. And we'll discuss that a lot more. And is the dialectics of how this whole process gets going. And then you see in Marx an extenuation of this in his dialectical materialism. Now, SK is commonly thought of as the founder of existentialism, along with Friedrich Nietzsche. And a lot of people who take some philosophy in college come across SK. I mean, he's pretty much standard reading, and you read Fear and Trembling and Sickness Unto Death. That's the standard book they pass out in philosophy courses. And the first impression that most people get is this pretty melancholy, depressing person who wrote books like Sickness Unto Death, Concept of Dread, Fear and Trembling, and so forth. And they're kind of put off by his melancholy on life. And he was melancholy. I mean, he really was. But the purpose of these books is to diagnose the human condition, and always with a view toward the alleviation of this condition of dread and the condition of depression and sickness unto death. And not to see it as inherent in human nature. These concepts, for which unfortunately SK has become synonymous, were used by SK in the same way that a doctor, for example, must describe a patient's condition in all its morbid detail in order to provide a cure. Titles such as Sickness Unto Death, Concept of Dread, Fear and Trembling do not seem to presage a cheerful look on life, but neither are they meant to, except by way of an existential dialectic which must take into account sin on its way to God. For SK, existentialism meant an investigation into what it means to be an existing individual, especially in relation to God. This investigation throughout his aesthetic and philosophical works took him through 3 stages of human existence, which he called the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And throughout all, he wrote with characters, pseudonyms, and so forth in a very complex way, in order to bring about this description in existential reality of what it means to find oneself, what it means to find truth, because to find oneself is also to find truth at the same time. SK's existentialism is not a philosophical system. It's not like Hegel or Marx, where you learn the system and then you know it. SK never attempted to be a teacher in that usual sense of the word that so many philosophers want to impose upon their readers as someone who just lectures truth from the lectern. He realized that truth is a way, not a result. And it's a way for the existing individual as long as he exists. And that's why he always called his philosophy an either-or, because an either-or is always a decision that the individual faces. His existential philosophy does not attempt to answer all questions, but it does answer a good many, which is the most that can be hoped for all who do not live in some unnatural realm, such as pure thought. And that's a 19th century idea we will get into in Hegel, sort of a mystical thinker, and in other German philosophers who were very popular during SK's time. Or the theocentric position was another term SK used in the understanding of Hegel's philosophy and also in the understanding of Marx. Because in the understanding of Hegel and Marx, they thought somehow they were able to understand existence is a finalized system in which all questions can be answered because the result or the end product of existence is known from the beginning. But for SK, that's not possible for the existing individual. He always faces an either or. He faces decisions and does not know the end. I mean, that's pretty commonsensical thinking. And that's what a lot of SK comes down to, is just basic common sense. It's not really that difficult. And that's what we're going to see throughout SK, is it gets back to real simple, commonsensical ideas, because truth is really simple. It is simple in the end. Getting there can be very complicated, but in the end, the truth is not a complicated process, a complicated idea. The idea of pure thought, in what we're going to get into later in Hegel, is comes from the works of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, in their attempt to overcome Kant's skepticism, in which he observed that empirical thinking does not include reality, does not embrace reality or the thing in itself. They are separate. And so these philosophers of the 19th century tried to overcome Kant's skepticism by trying to form an identity of thought and empirical being. And we're going to discuss all of this a lot more as we go along. Now, SK broke with this skepticism and said, yes, of course, it's right. Thought does not contain empirical reality. Except as a possibility in process of becoming. Hegel retained a mystical notion. He's sort of a strange mystical thinker, because a lot of what inspired Hegel really was mystical thinking that he got from Far Eastern religions. Eastern and Far Eastern religions. And he thought through a process of thinking called mediation and reconciliation, that he had been able to think in to a system to explain existence. Now, there is a system. There is a system. In Christianity, it's called the Logos. So to put it in Christian terms, Hegel thought that through mediation and reconciliation, he had been able to lock on or see into the Logos. And, well, for Christ, of course, Christ is the Logos, and that exists for God, but it does not exist, it cannot exist for any single individual. And so we're going to talk a lot about the Logos, the eternal idea coming into being, which actually goes back all the way to Plato and Aristotle. And we're going to see this play out throughout all of SK's philosophy, and how it plays into Western thinking. And another book I'll bring in quite a bit is a book, if I have it here, by Bertrand Russell, A History of Western Philosophy. And we'll see how these ideas about universals and particulars come in time and time again in Western philosophy, and how SK dealt with those ideas. Now, the book I've written here is not intended to be a substitute for SK. I encourage everyone to look into SK himself, but rather it is hopefully in my ambition on this book to introduce those students who really wish to get into SK an introduction, give them an introduction, a guide as to where to go and what his works mean in the aesthetic and philosophical, and how to understand them in the totality. Now, there was a great danger, of course, in oversimplifying SK. So I tried to avoid that. And hopefully I did that, because SK had a great skepticism of anyone who would try to summarize what he's all about, because he's not at all easy to summarize. He's very difficult. So that's the problem I had in writing the book, is going down this middle line of producing a book to summarize, but yet not to oversimplify. Hopefully, I have done this in this book. And the reason that I feel that it's important to write a book like this is because SK actually tried to make it difficult on his readers, and that seems absurd. Why would any author want to make his writings difficult? Well, for SK, it was really to get the reader, the student, involved in his own search for truth. Because SK felt, like Socrates felt, that the most anyone can do for another person is to quicken his mind, to make him pay attention, but not draw a conclusion. That is up to the individual himself to draw the conclusion. So I have three main objectives in this book. One is to keep the legacy of Soren Kierkegaard's thought alive. Two, to give a true understanding of SK's philosophy. And three, to write a book that's worthy of SK. And I didn't really set out to write a scholarly analysis of SK. I really meant to provide an insight for the average person who's more or less competent, like me, in theology and philosophy. Now, Pastor Schmidt, my pastor, said it is a scholarly book, and yeah, it is to a large extent, because there's no way of getting around that. And in an ironic sense, the book was written really to satisfy me, because I believe in art for art's sake and theology for the sake of theology. And I think when you can really find truth for yourself and know what that truth is, then you can truly share that with other people. As Polonius said to Laertes and Hamlet, "Unto thine own self be true, and then it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not be false to any man." And also I follow SK's observation about the crowd, the multitude. And he said this: "For a crowd is the untruth. In the godly sense it is true eternally. Christianity, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:24, that only one attains the goal, which is not meant in a comparative sense, for comparison takes others into account. It means that every man can be that one, God helping him therein. But only one attains the goal. And again, this means everyone should be chary about having to do with the others, and essentially should talk only with God and himself, for only one attains the goal." And this has to do with the solitary individual the person who seeks truth in his own way and has to do with himself and has to do with his own passionate interest in his own eternal salvation. And of course, it doesn't exclude fellowship with other Christians in any sense, but every person needs to go on that path himself. He needs to find that way individually. And in this book, I don't claim to be an official Kierkegaard scholar, as it's called in some places. In fact, at the University of Minnesota, they used to have, or maybe still have, an Ester in Kierkegaardian studies. Now, this may offend people. I don't know. My degree is in political science. It wasn't in philosophy, and I don't have a PhD in philosophy or theology. But in some ways, that's a plus, because in a lot of ways, when you go to seminary or learn philosophy in college, you learn the wrong things, and that's common throughout established religion and the established schools of philosophy, that you learn the mistakes that were made in prior centuries. So to come at it with a fresh point of view can be a very great advantage. And hopefully, excuse me, that's what I have, is this creative insight, a new insight from the standpoint of a layman into SK's writings. And I honestly believe that Kierkegaard would be completely happy with this, that because he had such a skepticism of the organized church and organized religion and the organized universities and philosophy. And he doubted very seriously if they would really appreciate what he wrote. And I think to a large extent that has definitely happened in the study of SK, in the universities especially. So I think SK would be very happy with this book. I hope he would be. And in a way, writing this book was to kind of, in a way, get SK out of my system, because he's so brilliant, and I obsessed for so many years over reading his writings and understanding him and studying him, that I wanted to write a book and kind of get it out of my system so I could go on to other books. I'm writing another book on existentialism, and then I've got 2 novels and another book on theology. And so I can't spend my whole life studying this wonderful, marvelous thinker. And so hopefully, to me, I can kind of let it out, and it'll be kind of a catharsis to go on to other things. So I really hope you read the book, and we'll continue in 30-minute segments for, I don't know, it's going to take a long time to get through the whole book, but I really felt that it's important to explain what I try to explain. I first started this at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and I thought, well, I should put this really in a more formal type of format, and then to give readers throughout the internet a more extensive explanation of what the book is all about. So I really hope you enjoy it. We're going to continue with the introduction in our next study, and then we're going to get into the background of SK, his indirect communication, and so forth. So I'll let you go until next time. And you can get the links on my Facebook page. All you do is go to facebook.com, and then you type in my name, and I'll have all the links. This will be SK Study 1, and Study 2, Study 3, Study 4, etc. will come later. Okay, thanks for attending, and goodbye.